The USS Juneau, a World War II ship found after 75 years beneath the Pacific. But here's what they don't tell you about this discovery. When divers finally reached the wreck in 2018, they found something that made hardened naval historians break down and cry. Because this wasn't just any shipwreck. This was the tomb of 5 brothers who made a pact that would haunt their family forever. And what happened in those final moments before the ship vanished? Well, that's where our story gets really dark. Because the Sullivan brothers thought they were staying together to protect each other. They had no idea they were actually sealing their fate in the most horrific way imaginable. And the survivors who lived to tell this tale, what they witnessed will make you question everything you think you know about brotherhood and sacrifice. Because when you hear what George Sullivan did in those final moments, floating in shark-infested waters, calling out for his dead brothers, it'll haunt you for weeks. So buckle up. This isn't just a story about a sunken ship. This is about the price of loyalty, the cost of family bonds, and why sometimes the people we love most are the ones who doom us. 5 brothers from Iowa walked into a Navy recruitment office in 1942 with one demand. They serve together or not at all. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan weren't just being stubborn. They were breaking a military rule that existed for a very good reason. See, the Navy had learned something awful about putting family members on the same ship, but the Sullivans didn't care. They'd heard about Pearl Harbor, and they wanted revenge for their friend who died on the USS Arizona. So they made the Navy an ultimatum. And here's the thing that'll chill you to the bone. The Navy said yes. They assigned all 5 brothers to the USS Juneau, a brand new light cruiser heading to the Pacific. The Sullivan family was so proud. They had no idea they'd just signed a death warrant for their entire bloodline. But the really twisted part? The Navy knew exactly what could happen. They'd seen families wiped out before. But they were desperate for recruits, and the Sullivan brothers were good sailors. Plus, the propaganda value was too good to pass up. 5 brothers, all American as apple pie, fighting together for freedom. The recruiting office in Waterloo, Iowa, had never seen anything like it. These weren't just any brothers either. These were Irish-American boys raised on stories of sticking together no matter what. Their parents, Thomas and Alida Sullivan, had drilled it into them from birth. Family first, always family first. George was the oldest at 27, a tough guy who worked the railroads. Francis was 26, the quiet one. Joseph, 24, was the joker of the family. Madison, 23, was the thoughtful one. And Albert, just 20, was the baby they all protected. They'd grown up in the same house, played on the same streets, and now they were going to war on the same ship. What they didn't know was that their family loyalty was about to collide with the brutal mathematics of naval warfare. Because 76 years later, when they finally found the wreck, they discovered something that proved the Navy's worst fears had come true. The USS Juneau was an Atlanta-class light cruiser, 541 feet of pure firepower designed to shoot down Japanese planes. Commissioned on Valentine's Day 1942, she was armed with 16 5-inch guns and could hit 32 knots. The Sullivan brothers were assigned as gunners and sailors, scattered across different sections of the ship. Now, here's what's really messed up. The Navy actually had unofficial policies about family members serving together, because they'd seen what happened when entire bloodlines got wiped out. During World War I, they'd lost multiple brothers on single ships, and it had destroyed entire families. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating. But the Sullivans were persistent, and the Navy was desperate for recruits, so they made an exception. The brothers even appeared in recruitment materials, smiling in their matching uniforms. The propaganda department loved them. Here were 5 clean-cut American boys, ready to fight for democracy. The irony is that the Juneau was actually one of the safest assignments they could have gotten. Atlanta-class cruisers were designed to stay back and provide anti-aircraft cover. They weren't supposed to get into close-range slugging matches with enemy ships. They were supposed to shoot down planes and protect the big carriers. But there was something else about the Juneau that made this decision even more dangerous. This ship was heading to the Solomon Islands, where the Japanese had turned the waters into a killing field. The area around Guadalcanal was already being called Iron Bottom Sound because so many ships had been sunk there. The Sullivan brothers didn't know they were sailing into what would become one of the most brutal naval campaigns of the entire war. They thought they were going to escort some carriers, shoot down some Japanese planes, and come home heroes. They had no idea they were entering a meat grinder where ships disappeared every single night. And what was waiting for them in those dark Pacific waters would prove that some family bonds are meant to be broken. See, the Juneau wasn't just any ship heading to any battle. She was bound for Guadalcanal, a meat grinder where the Japanese had submarines lurking like sharks, waiting to pick off Allied vessels. The waters around the Solomon Islands had already claimed dozens of ships. The Navy knew this. They knew the Juneau would be sailing through what sailors called Iron Bottom Sound, nicknamed that, because so many ships had been sunk there that the seafloor was carpeted with twisted metal. But here's what makes the Sullivan story even more tragic. Their decision to serve together wasn't just about patriotism or revenge. It was about an Irish-American family tradition of sticking together no matter what. Their parents had taught them that family comes first, always. Thomas Sullivan had worked the railroads his whole life, and he'd taught his boys that you never leave a brother behind. Aleta Sullivan had raised them in the Catholic faith, where family bonds were sacred. These weren't just military recruits. These were boys who'd been programmed from birth to stick together. The family had already lost a friend, Bill Ball, who died on the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. That loss had hit them hard, but it had also united them in their desire for revenge. They weren't just going to war as individuals. They were going as a family unit, a fighting team. What nobody understood at the time was that this family loyalty would become a tactical weakness. In naval warfare, you need sailors who can think independently, who can follow orders even when it means leaving their brothers behind. The Sullivan brothers would never be able to do that. They would always choose family over duty. And the Navy should have known better. They had regulations about family members serving together, but they bent those rules because they needed good sailors and good publicity. The Sullivan brothers gave them both. But on November 13, 1942, as the Juneau limped away from a brutal night battle, that family bond was about to be tested in the most horrific way possible. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who destroy us. And what happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Because when that Japanese torpedo hit, it didn't just sink a ship. It created a floating nightmare that would last 8 days and 7 nights. And the few men who lived through it? What they saw George Sullivan do in those final moments will absolutely destroy you. But first, you need to understand just how catastrophic that explosion really was. Because this wasn't just a torpedo hit. This was an annihilation. November 13, 1942. The USS Juneau had already taken a beating in a vicious night battle near Guadalcanal. A Japanese torpedo had ripped into her port side, and she was listing 15 degrees, barely staying afloat. The ship was limping away with the rest of the task force, trying to make it to safety. On board, the Sullivan brothers were at their battle stations, probably thinking the worst was over. They were wrong, dead wrong. The night battle had been chaos. Japanese destroyers had come screaming out of the darkness, guns blazing, torpedoes in the water. Ships were exploding left and right. The Juneau had taken that first torpedo hit around 2 a.m., and it had knocked out her steering and power. She was dead in the water, listing badly to port. But Captain Lyman Swenson had managed to get emergency power restored. The damage control teams had shored up the flooding compartments. By dawn, they had the ship moving again at about 18 knots. Not fast, but fast enough to keep up with the retreating task force. The Sullivan brothers were scattered across the ship. George was in one of the gun turrets. Francis was down in the engine room. Joseph was at his battle station amidships. Madison was with the damage control party. Albert was in another gun mount. They probably talked to each other over the ship's communication system. Probably checked in to make sure everyone was okay after that first torpedo hit. They were still together, still on the same ship, still looking out for each other. Because lurking beneath the waves was submarine I-26, and its captain had just spotted the wounded American ships. At 11:01 a.m., he fired a spread of torpedoes. Most missed their targets, but one torpedo, just one, found the Juneau's weakened hull. And here's the part that still makes naval experts sick to their stomachs. That torpedo hit right next to the ship's ammunition storage. Right next to the powder magazines that fed the main guns. Right next to tons and tons of high explosives. What happened next took exactly 20 seconds. But those 20 seconds would echo through 76 years. The explosion was so massive that ships 20 miles away felt the shock wave. Eyewitnesses said the USS Juneau didn't just sink, she evaporated. A column of smoke and flame shot 1,000 feet into the air. The entire middle section of the ship simply vanished, leaving only scattered debris floating on the oil-slicked water. Survivors from other ships described it as the most horrific thing they'd ever seen. One sailor said it looked like the hand of God had reached down and crushed the ship like a tin can. Another said the explosion was so bright it hurt to look at, even from miles away. The blast was equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. The powder magazines had contained hundreds of tons of explosives, and when that torpedo set them off, it created a chain reaction that literally vaporized the center of the ship. The bow and stern sections were blown apart and sank separately. Of the 697 men aboard, 687 died instantly, or within minutes. Most never even knew what hit them. The explosion was so fast, so complete, that they simply ceased to exist. 3 of the Sullivan brothers, Francis, Joseph, and Madison, were likely killed in the initial blast. They were in the sections of the ship that vanished. Their bodies were never found, never recovered. They became part of the explosion itself. Albert Sullivan died from his wounds shortly after hitting the water. Survivors later said they saw him floating face down, blood streaming from his head and chest. The blast had thrown him clear of the ship, but the injuries were too severe. But George Sullivan, he survived the explosion. He made it to a life raft with about 115 other men. And that's where the real horror began. Because floating in those shark-infested waters, surrounded by pieces of his dead brother's ship, George Sullivan was about to face a choice that no human being should ever have to make. And what he decided to do would haunt the other survivors for the rest of their lives. For 8 days, the survivors clung to debris in the middle of the Pacific. They had no food, no fresh water, and sharks circling constantly. Men were dying from their wounds, from dehydration, from exposure. But George Sullivan had something worse eating at him: the knowledge that his 4 brothers were gone. The family pact that had brought them together had killed them all. Survivor Alan Hain later described what those 8 days were like. He said it was hell on earth. The sun during the day would cook them alive. At night, they'd shiver in the cold ocean water. The salt water would get into their wounds and burn like fire. But the sharks were the worst part. They were everywhere, circling the life rafts, bumping up against the survivors. Haynes said you could see their fins cutting through the water all around you. And every few hours, someone would just disappear. A scream, a splash, and they'd be gone. George Sullivan watched all of this. He watched men die from thirst. He watched them go insane from the sun and the salt. He watched the sharks drag away sailors who'd survived the explosion only to die in the most horrible way possible. But George had something even worse to deal with. He knew his brothers were dead. He knew the family that had raised him, that had shaped him, that had defined his entire life, was gone. He was the only Sullivan left, and he couldn't handle it. Survivor Alan Hayne later described what happened on the third or fourth day. George started talking to his dead brothers, calling out their names. He'd have entire conversations with Francis and Joseph and Madison and Albert, as if they were sitting right there on the raft with him. Then he stood up in the raft, stripped off his clothes, and announced he was going for a bath. Before anyone could stop him, he dove into the shark-infested water and swam away. He was never seen again. The other survivors believe the sharks got him. But here's the thing that'll break your heart. George didn't go insane. He made a conscious choice. He chose to join his brothers rather than live without them. The family bond that had brought the Sullivan brothers together had ultimately destroyed them all. George couldn't bear to be the only one left. He couldn't live with the guilt, the loneliness, the knowledge that he'd survived when his brothers hadn't. And 76 years later, when they finally found the wreck, they discovered something that proved the Sullivan brothers are still together. Because when those deep-sea cameras reached the ocean floor in 2018, what they found wasn't just twisted metal and coral. It was a time capsule that revealed the true cost of loyalty. And the date they found it, that was no coincidence. The discovery would change everything we thought we knew about the Sullivan brothers, and it would prove that some bonds really are stronger than death. March 17, 2018, St. Patrick's Day. The research vessel Petrel, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, was scanning the ocean floor near the Solomon Islands. At 13,800 feet down, their sonar picked up something massive. When they sent down the underwater cameras, what they saw stopped them cold. There, sitting on the Pacific seafloor, was the stern section of the USS Juneau. And you could still read the name painted on the hull, Juneau, after 76 years underwater. But here's what made the Discovery team emotional. The date wasn't random. St. Patrick's Day was a nod to the Sullivan brothers' Irish heritage. It was like the ocean itself had chosen the perfect moment to give up its secret. Robert Kraft, the expedition leader, later said that when they first saw the wreck, the entire control room went silent. Grown men who'd been exploring shipwrecks for decades started tearing up. Because this wasn't just another piece of history they'd found. This was a gravesite. This was the final resting place of 5 brothers who'd died together, just like they'd wanted. The bow and stern were sitting next to each other, but the middle section, where the explosion happened, was scattered across nearly a kilometer of sea floor. It was physical proof of the violence that had torn this ship apart. Paul Allen himself was on board the Petrel when they made the discovery. He'd been funding these expeditions to find lost warships, to honor the men who died in them. But finding the Juneau was different. This ship had a story that everyone knew. This ship represented something more than just military history. The cameras captured everything in stunning detail. The guns were still mounted, covered in marine growth. Fish swam through what used to be crew quarters. Coral had grown over the deck where the Sullivan brothers had once walked. But there was something else about the discovery that sent chills down everyone's spine. Something that proved the Sullivan brothers had gotten exactly what they'd asked for. But what they found in the debris field revealed something even more powerful about the Sullivan brothers' legacy. The wreck site is now a graveyard covered in marine life. Coral has grown over the guns, fish swim through what used to be crew quarters, and the metal is slowly being consumed by the sea. But it's also a monument. Every piece of debris tells the story of that catastrophic explosion. The twisted steel shows exactly how the ammunition magazine detonated. The scattered hull sections prove how quickly the ship broke apart. And somewhere in that debris field are the remains of the Sullivan brothers, still together, still on the same ship, just like they wanted. The Discovery team treated the site like a war grave, which it is. They didn't disturb anything, didn't take any artifacts. They just filmed and photographed, documenting what 76 years on the ocean floor had done to America's most tragic warship. The footage shows the incredible power of that explosion. The middle section of the ship, where the powder magazines were located, is just gone, obliterated. But the bow and stern sections, while damaged, are still recognizable as parts of a warship. Marine archaeologists who studied the footage said it was one of the most complete pictures they'd ever seen of a catastrophic ship explosion. The blast pattern, the way the metal was twisted and torn, the distance between the bow and stern sections, it all told the story of what happened in those 20 seconds when the Juneau died. But there's something else the Discovery revealed. Something that shows the incredible durability of steel and paint and human memory. After 76 years underwater, in the corrosive salt water of the Pacific, you can still read the ship's name on the stern. Juneau, clear as day. It's like the ocean wanted to make sure nobody forgot what happened here. Like the sea itself was preserving the memory of the Sullivan brothers and all the other sailors who died that day. The Discovery also revealed something about the current condition of the wreck. It's slowly deteriorating, being consumed by the sea. In another 50 or 100 years, there might not be much left. The ocean gives up its secrets, but it also takes them back. But there's something else the Discovery revealed, something that shows how the Sullivan brothers' sacrifice changed everything about how we think about family and war. The loss of the Sullivan brothers forced the Navy to create what's now called the Sullivan Rule. Siblings can't serve on the same ship during wartime. It's a policy that saved countless families from experiencing what the Sullivans went through. But finding the wreck in 2018 did something else. It reminded us that the ocean never forgets. Every ship that goes down becomes a time capsule, preserving not just steel and equipment, but human stories. The USS Juneau isn't just a wreck. It's a monument to the idea that some bonds are stronger than death. The Sullivan brothers got their wish. They stayed together. And now, 76 years later, they're still together on the Pacific floor, surrounded by the ship that was supposed to protect them. The Discovery also proved something else, that sometimes the most tragic stories are the ones that need to be remembered most. Because in a world where families are scattered and loyalty is rare, the Sullivan brothers remind us what it means to truly have each other's backs. After the Discovery, the Navy officially designated the wreck site as a war grave. It's protected under international law. Nobody can disturb it. Nobody can take anything from it. It's a sacred place now, an underwater cemetery where the Sullivan brothers rest eternal. The irony is that the brothers finally got what they always wanted. They're together forever, on the same ship, in the same service. Death couldn't separate them. Time couldn't separate them. Even the vast Pacific Ocean couldn't separate them. But their sacrifice also changed military policy forever. The Sullivan Rule has prevented countless other families from experiencing the same tragedy. In that way, the Sullivan brothers' death saved other families, other brothers, other sons. The discovery of the wreck also revealed something about the nature of memory and grief. For 76 years, the Sullivan family had no grave to visit, no place to mourn. The brothers were just gone, lost somewhere in the vast Pacific. But now there's a place. Now there's a location where their sacrifice is marked and remembered. The wreck site has become a pilgrimage destination for their surviving family members and for anyone who wants to honor their memory. But their story raises a question that haunts military families to this day. Was their loyalty beautiful or tragic? And would you make the same choice? The Sullivan brothers' story didn't end when the Juneau sank. In many ways, it was just beginning. Their parents, Thomas and Aleta Sullivan, became the face of American grief during World War II. The Navy assigned them a special detail to help them cope with the loss of all 5 sons. Aleta Sullivan became a symbol of maternal sacrifice. appearing at war bond rallies and speaking to families who'd lost children in the war. But behind the public face, the family was destroyed. How do you survive losing 5 children at once? How do you wake up every morning knowing that your entire future, your entire bloodline, died in 20 seconds on the other side of the world? Thomas Sullivan died in 1965, never fully recovering from the loss. Oleta lived until 1972, carrying the grief for 30 years. She used to say that she died with her boys in 1942, that everything after was just going through the motions. The Navy tried to honor the family by naming a destroyer after the brothers. The USS The Sullivans was commissioned in 1943, with Oleta herself christening the ship. It was meant to be a tribute, but imagine how she must have felt, watching another warship slide into the water, knowing it was named after her dead sons. The story became a Hollywood movie in 1944, The Fighting Sullivans, starring Thomas Mitchell and Ann Baxter. It was meant to boost morale, to show American audiences what sacrifice looked like. But for the Sullivan family, it must have been torture to watch their tragedy turned into entertainment. The brothers also became recruitment tools. Their faces appeared on posters throughout the war, encouraging other young men to enlist. They gave their lives for freedom, the posters said. What will you give? But here's what those posters didn't mention. The 10 survivors from the Juneau carried their own trauma for the rest of their lives. Alan Hayne, who watched George Sullivan swim away to die, never got over it. He used to have nightmares about sharks for decades afterward. Frank Holmgren, another survivor, rarely talked about what happened. When he did, he'd break down crying. The image of the ship exploding, of his shipmates dying in the water, never left him. The survivors felt guilty for living when so many others had died. They felt guilty for not being able to save George Sullivan. They felt guilty for being rescued when the Sullivan brothers never were. This is the hidden cost of the Sullivan story. It's not just about 5 brothers who died together. It's about parents who lost everything. It's about survivors who carried trauma for the rest of their lives. It's about a military policy that had to be changed because family loyalty had become a weakness. But the discovery of the wreck in 2018 brought a strange kind of closure. For the first time in 76 years, there was a place where the Sullivan brothers could be mourned. There was a location, coordinates on a map, where their sacrifice was marked. The current Sullivan family members, distant cousins and relatives, finally had somewhere to send flowers, somewhere to say prayers, somewhere to remember the boys who died so young. And the wreck itself has become something beautiful. The coral that covers the ship has created an artificial reef. Fish live in the spaces where sailors once worked. Life has reclaimed death. The ocean has turned a monument to destruction into a garden of life. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Sullivan brothers. Not just the military policy that bears their name, not just the ships and movies and memorials. Maybe their real legacy is the reminder that family bonds are the most powerful force in human nature. The Sullivan brothers chose family over safety. They chose loyalty over survival. They chose each other over everything else. And in the end, they got exactly what they wanted. They stayed together forever. But that choice cost them everything. It cost their parents their entire future. It cost the Navy 5 good sailors. It cost America a family that should have lived to have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The question that haunts their story is whether that choice was worth it. Whether family loyalty is worth dying for. Whether love is more important than life. There's no easy answer to that question. But the Sullivan brothers answered it with their lives. They said yes, family is worth dying for. Yes, loyalty is more important than survival. Yes, some bonds are stronger than death itself. And now, 76 years later, sitting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, covered in coral and surrounded by fish, they're still proving that point. They're still together. They're still on the same ship. They're still brothers. The ocean that killed them has also preserved them. The water that separated them from their family has become their eternal home. The Pacific that took their lives has given them immortality. Because as long as that wreck sits on the ocean floor, as long as people remember their story, as long as families struggle with the balance between love and loss, the Sullivan brothers will live on. They wanted to serve together, fight together, and if necessary, die together. They got their wish, and in getting it, they taught us something profound about the price of loyalty and the power of family bonds. Their story asks us a question that every family has to answer. How far would you go for the people you love? What would you sacrifice to stay together? What price are you willing to pay for loyalty? The Sullivan brothers answered those questions with their lives. Now it's up to us to decide if their answer was right. Was the Sullivan brothers' loyalty a beautiful thing or a tragic mistake? And in your own family, would you make the same choice they did? Because the answer to that question reveals everything about what family really means. Think about the people you love most. Think about the bonds that define your life. And ask yourself, are those bonds worth dying for? Because somewhere on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, 5 brothers are still answering that question. Share your family's military stories in the comments below. Which bonds are worth dying for? And which family members would you choose to stay with, no matter what the cost?